Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to Institute for Personal Development, where total consciousness is the new frontier. Kriya Yoga is the union of the individual with the divine. Join us as we explore the practices that initiate this process.
Good morning. Welcome to the Voice of Yoga. Let's talk consciousness. I am your hostess, Lisa Winton, and with me is Kenny Toy, also known as Swami Jayananda, founder of Institute for Personal Development, located here in Hampton, New Hampshire. Well, good morning, Swami. Thank you for being here today. How are you?
Good morning. I'm doing well today. How about you?
I'm doing wonderful, thanks. Beautiful day today. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in. And today on The Voice of Yoga, we'll be talking about Senses Appreciation Day, which is celebrated every year on June 24th. We will discuss the development of the lower mind, which is directly related to the five senses, and how important they are in the upgrading to the higher mind. Swami will explain the fifth stage of Kriya Yoga, Pratyahara, which means sense withdrawal, and why we would want to do that. He will review some of the techniques employed in Kriya Yoga to heighten sensual awareness without losing control or becoming attached to energy fields and force fields that are limiting. So, Swami, I think we have a lot to talk about today. So let's talk about upgrading to the higher mind. What do the senses have to do with that exactly?
Well, the lower mind, what we talk about is this whole concept of intelligence, that we have four mental functions: perception, reason, memory, intuition. And the five senses are directly related to perception. Perception is how we interact with our environment. It's how we take in information from our environment. So it's that part of the mind that is actually acquiring all of this information or data that we're accumulating. Reason is how we organize that information. It's how we systemize and categorize the information. Memory, the concept of feeling, is what happens with regard to having recall of an experience, so that you can actually do a comparative test. What happened the last time something happened? It falls under the realms of our patterning and conditioned responses that we record. And then intuition is the whole concept of prescience, our ability to fabricate probable realities, to take consideration for consequences, so that, say, for example, if I do this, there's a possibility of this, this, and this to happen. That's what we call being intelligent. When your four mental functions are performing, that you're processing and tailoring your response as opposed to just reacting to something. So you're taking in your data through your senses, you're organizing it, you're comparing it to what happened the last time something happened, and then also taking consideration for consequences. That's a big part of the development of what we call becoming intelligent, which is what we call the lower mind. It corresponds with what we'll call rational thinking. But it is very limiting, because the part of the mind that is directly related to our senses can only do one thing at a time. So say, for example, if you are seeing, you're not hearing. If you're hearing, you're not seeing. We can switch back and forth very quickly, but in reality, you're just doing it one at a time. So we're missing data as a result of that. But a big part of this development of the lower mind is working with senses. And this whole thing of Sense Appreciation Day. Because being spiritual doesn't mean that you are not sensual. In fact, you operate from a heightened sense of awareness, acute sensitivity. You're just not controlled by your senses. And of course, you're very selective about things that you are using to enhance your performance.
That's all very interesting. I have a question for you. In my research about celebration of the Senses Day, they recommend that you give your senses a little bit of a kick. In other words, they say some of the things that you can do is, blindfold yourself and smell the different foods in the refrigerator one at a time. So that you get this idea of not relying on your sight, but you're relying on your sense of smell in that particular case.
Well, what you're basically doing is you're isolating a particular sense. That's what I was talking about. That we have the tendency to overload our senses because we're being bombarded. So if you do isolate a particular thing, like you say, you close off your eyes and you eliminate all the other senses, then of course it brings a focal point to that particular sense, and it will enhance your awareness of that.
So you would recommend people doing those little exercises like that, like listening to music in the dark, blindfolding yourself and touching different things and see if you can figure out what it is that you're touching. All this is to enhance the experience of our perception.
Yeah, I would say that. Sure, absolutely. And anything that you can do to increase your performance, to me, is to your advantage, and especially with regard to the goals and objectives of the science of yoga, because we really have to refine ourselves. Because remember this whole thing that we said we were going to talk about, Pratyahara, sense withdrawal, our ability to disconnect from one source of sustenance. See, that's one of the things that we're not typically accustomed to understanding is that when you practice yoga, you're trying to join with a different source of sustenance, a dimension of reality that's invisible and intangible. So you definitely have to be operating at a heightened sense of awareness in order to be able to perceive it. And a big part of development in yoga is refinement of your senses, acute sensitivity, because you're trying to be able to recognize something that is very difficult. And if you are overloaded on a sensual level, you won't have awareness or sensitivity for something that is this subtle, the void or the nothing. And so one of the things that I really like when working with the senses, you want to understand the multi-application of senses. Say, for example, our eyes see, but then they also show. Our ears hear, but they also balance. Our mouths taste, but they also speak. The nose smells, but it also breathes. And the hands, they touch, but they also give. So more and more trying to understand different applications of things other than just taking in data, that everything in this universe is on this pulse that we take in, but at the same time we also give back.
I find it very interesting that we need the physical body to achieve this connection to spirit. And we talk about this all the time, that you can't connect to spirit without the body and the mind. I just find it very interesting that here's another aspect that proves this point that that's what we need to move further in our spirituality.
Oh, absolutely. Matter and mind, they definitely need each other. And that's one of the reasons why in these earlier religions they were so precise with their rituals and ceremonies, ordeals, ascetic practices. And none of it was random punishment, opting for some position in an afterlife. It was all about refining the mind-body complex to attune it to this concealed deity, this invisible, intangible source of sustenance that was called God or was called the One or the Void or the Nothing. Whatever it was called doesn't make it any less important. And the other thing is that the same thing that was talked about in scriptures that were written 5,000 years ago is here right now. And that's one of the things that we typically always say. The problem with humanity today isn't God's love for humanity. It's humanity's love for God. We just don't know what it is. And we think we're connected to something, but it's not giving us the return that these books were talking about. And that's one of the things we always talk about is we just don't have good leadership. We don't have people showing us what it's like when you have separated from your attachment to things that are visible and tangible and things that are invisible and tangible, and you now are connected, hardwired to something that is invisible and intangible. And that's when you hear what we call the Om. That's when the human mind-body complex really starts up, because it isn't designed to run on these other resources.
I was reading on a website about Census Day, and they made the claim that if you sense the world, if you see the world in grays, or if you are having difficulties smelling, a flower or something like that, that is actually a sign of a depression, because it actually does affect the senses. So when I read that, I wanted to make sure I asked you what your point of view of that might be.
Well, again, I'm sure that things are probably a lot more complicated than things of that nature, and there are many different forms of depression. Not all depression is what I call dysfunctional. That, especially when we're going through points of passage, that when you're leaving something that's safe, familiar, comfortable, and known, and you're embarking on the anxiety, the uncertainty of the unknown, it's really common to go through a period of depression, because that's how we process things. And sometimes, it's just like if you've ever seen, say, for example, like a snake when it's going to shed its skin, that the actual appearance of the snake seems somewhat hazy. And then when all of a sudden they shed that skin and what's underneath is very pristine and sharp in color. Sometimes that's the ebb and flow of our own development that we go through, that it might not necessarily be a dysfunctional depression. Mm-hmm. Again, you're leaving something that's safe, familiar, comfortable, and known, and now you're embarking on something that is brand new, unfamiliar.
Well, I have some other questions, but I think I'll put those on hold, and so we can hear a word from our sponsors. So listeners, we'll be back with you shortly. If you are looking for a Samadhi-based experience, IPD Kriya Yoga has the goods. A complete yoga program that includes the practices and the process. Kriya Yoga Series 1 live classes and videos,
get your arms around the spiritual science of Kriya Yoga.
You know, the intention of why we practice is to embody spirit, to feel connected to the life force.
Kriya Yoga Asana live classes and videos, a cosmically engineered system of exercises to initiate apotheosis. A system of exercises engineered for dining and dancing at the Cosmic Ballroom. Kriya Yoga Series 2 live classes and videos, a practice in open form designed to facilitate positive growth of consciousness. Get your Labyrinth video.
I find the positive side of it is it pulls a lot of things together.
Kriya Yoga mantra and meditation. With repetition comes absorption. Pray on prana and become divine.
At the same time, we all have a unique talent and gift to give back to the universe.
Private session. The mysteries of the universe have always been handed down verbally from teacher to student. Call or click now and get started. 603-929-0303 or www.ipdtransform.com. Namaste.
Welcome back. For those of you just joining us, you are listening to Voice of Yoga, and we are talking consciousness. So, Swami, in the description, I had mentioned that we could talk about some of the techniques that we employ in Kriya Yoga to heighten sensual awareness. So, what can we advise our listeners or the early initiates who are interested in Kriya Yoga? What can they do to employ some of those strategies, those techniques?
Well, what we talk about is the fifth stage of yoga, Pratyahara, sense withdrawal. That's when the conscious mind emerges superior to instinct, appetite, preservation, and survival. That's when the term we call is when we are now becoming intelligent in our decision-making as opposed to emotional or reactive. And anything that you do where you're exercising your psychological organs, kind of like what we were talking about last week, things like fasting or adherence to dietary recommendations or adherence to an exercise program, kind of like what you were saying, even just getting up at a particular time is something that moves us beyond our reflex response. And with regard to the whole concept of sense withdrawal, that you have to understand that one of the biggest misconceptions in the spiritual community is that we're trying to kill our senses so that we don't get stuck in this lower vibration of the world. That's not what you want to do. The whole thing of sense deprivation is when the mind is turned back in on itself and is confronted with the void or the nothing. So it's 180 degrees from duality and stimulation, which brings us face to face with this thing called the divine. Now, the intention of the practice of yoga is really to yoke your body, the desires or the heart of the body, the feeling center of the body with the void or the nothing, so that we now desire nothing as opposed to try and stop desire.
So it's not that we don't want to see or stop hearing or feeling or touching or anything like that. It's a level of consciousness as it relates to those senses.
Yeah, and in reality, what you're trying to do is refine yourself so you can perceive a different source of sustenance, a different dimension of reality. That's one of the things that we always say, that you have to be strong enough to walk the solitary path, but also sensitive enough to hear the call. And the one-size-fits-all solution to this is this internal connection. Your first stage in yoga, yama, and your fifth yama, brahmacharya, carrier of Brahman. Once we have kind of gotten this other branch in our other hand, once we start to recognize the importance of our number one need, then you start to turn towards this invisible, intangible resource. Because being spiritual is not deprivation. You're not abstaining. You're actually indulging. That's why we call it a conversion. You're not drawing off of duality anymore. And that's one of the indicators that you start to use, is that whatever you desire is going to determine the outcome of your spiritual practice. If you're desiring things that are visible and tangible, then you are still trapped in a source of sustenance that's going to be limiting. It's going to keep your mind small, and your feelings will be reduced to insatiable cravings. And you're in the realms of suffering and decay, so therefore you're going to have this kickback. Your inner environment will be inundated with the guilt, the shame, the anger, the resentment, the blame, the emptiness, and the boredom that we cycle through. But once you make this internal connection, once you separate from your attachment to that, and you join with this other source of sustenance, and you become literally addicted to it, matter and mind come together with new information. And that begins this progressive cycle, this process of apotheosis, this process of the human becoming divine. And the changes start to reveal themselves.
I think I understand what you're saying. I think I have had glimpses in my life, or moments in my life, where the connection to spirit was so strong that it seems that I clearly remember the colors of my surroundings, the sounds, the sights. Everything has that, unbelievable picture in my mind. It's so vivid. Am I right in thinking that was my glimpse of being connected to spirit?
Well, to answer your question, I don't know. It's so hard to be able to evaluate. Sometimes people talk about these experiences where things have become amplified and heightened, and most of that could be the result of so many other variables that it may not necessarily be because you are totally established in your relationship with your divinity. And one of the things I always like is kind of like what Jayananda says in his book, Spiritual Science of Kriya Yoga, that great things are just very difficult to calculate. It's like we don't hear the earth moving, kind of a thing. You might hear cars driving on the earth or elephants running on the earth, but the earth itself, which is much bigger than all of that, kind of goes unnoticed. And that's more how I look at a spiritual experience, that you're trying to sense something that is not perceivable. And so it might not have the same impact that something tangible and visible will have, or something that is invisible and tangible, like a vision.
These are exactly the type of things that we talk about in our Theory 2 program, how we relate to the world and working on that sense of awareness. So do you feel like having a sense of awareness of everything that's around you constantly, and that helps connect you to the world, which in turn will connect you to spirit as well?
Well, to answer your question, that's exactly what happens. That's why meditation, by definition, is the 7th stage of yoga. It's the 8th stage of Buddhism. See, meditation isn't an activity that you do independent of life. It's a state of being. See, the meditative state, which is 2 states beyond Pratyahara, marks the phase where your mind opens. Your identity transcends the limits of your body. That you now have awareness of not only what's going on in your physical body, but at the same time what's going on in your mind. So that to me is a much more heightened sense of awareness than me just being able to isolate the flavor of a grape in my mouth. Mm-hmm. And the only way that you can get to this meditative state is through a metaphysical or a mystical system. You have to rebirth your body in this invisible, intangible resource. That's what produces this progressive cycle where your mind starts to open. And your whole field of awareness transcends the limits of just your physical body. Because that's one of the things we always say. When the mind is small, we kind of feel like a victim. Mm-hmm. And say, for example, how can you tell how broad your sense of awareness is kind of like when we're doing an asana class. If you have awareness of what's going on in your left foot and you don't know what's going on in your right hand, then your mind has to be moved through the body, kind of like a flashlight in a dark room. When the mind finally opens, now you have awareness of what's going on in your left foot and your right hand. Simultaneously, it's more like being in a lighted room. And so hopefully to answer your question, it's really more about this opening of the mind than the simple fact that I have awareness of what's going on under the narrow beam of the flashlight, if that answers your question.
I think it does. I think what I'm going to do for the next 2 days as an exercise for myself is, work on that heightened sense of awareness and work on the senses, and then be able to talk about any findings that I might have on the Theory 2 class on Thursday, and maybe I would encourage, our other students to do that as well. Maybe that's something that we can talk about on Thursday is take this, the lessons that you talked about on the show today and continue to talk about it on Thursday night.
Yeah, because it's not something you're going to be able to really unpack in a half an hour show. Let's put it that way. It's a pretty extensive subject. But that's what we try and do, is we try and take the small steps one at a time and just try and have this sense of awareness of what is it that we're trying to do, expand the conscious mind. Total consciousness is the goal of yoga. And then, of course, where does it begin? With the development of the lower mind. Mm-hmm. And part of that is the part of the mind that's directly related to our senses. And just by honing and developing, we start to make advancement.
Well, thank you for your explanation today. What a great show we have today. But I think it's time to start closing down our program. So, listeners, I would invite you out there to visit our website. You can follow Swami on Pinterest and Twitter and Facebook, of course. Also available to you listeners are the online classes you can access through our website, www.ipdtransform.com. Just click on the link for online classes. It will direct you to Powwow, and from there make your selection. Maybe we'll see you Thursday night for our Theory 2 class. But do keep those comments and questions and curiosities coming. Swami does enjoy hearing from you. And be sure to tune in next week. We will be celebrating July 4th, Independence, Liberty, and Freedom, Kriya Yoga style. So, Swami, any final thoughts before we say goodbye to our listeners?
Well, I would like to invite people to join us. And this particular Sunday and mantra, we're going to dedicate it to Andy Blacksmith from WHEB, who passed away last weekend. And with that, I'll wish everybody a good day. Namaste. And I'll give it back to you.
Thank you for listening to our program, The Voice of Yoga. This is Lisa Winton along with Swami Jayananda signing off. Have a wonderful Kriya Yoga kind of day. Namaste.